On the eastern border of the Byzantine Empire, unusual newcomers appeared. They were dressed strangely and spoke an incomprehensible language. No one knew where they came from or why they were there. The Byzantines called them Atsinganos, a term adopted by the empire's neighbors and eventually passed down to us as gypsies. 1,000 years have passed since then, yet the Roma remain a mysterious people. They are private and hesitant to open up to the outside world. Both then and now, most live in such extreme poverty it's hard to even imagine. But today, we'll take a different look at the Roma people through the lens of history and politics. We'll explore why the Roma live the way they do and why they still don't have a state of their own. As you'll see, the answer is anything but simple. Before diving into this topic, let me make a quick disclaimer. Some of you may have had negative experiences with the Roma or with people you thought resembled them. Personal experiences are important, and I'm not here to convince you that anyone is good or bad. This discussion is about something else. Today, the Roma are the most famous example of a people not only without a state but even without autonomy. The Roma face immense challenges finding official work, accessing education, and receiving healthcare. These issues, like the Roma themselves, cross the borders of many countries. There are few places where the Roma live comfortably, and often, news of crime seems to follow them. Some believe these problems could be solved if they had their own state. But why, in 1,000 years of history in Europe, has this not happened? Why do the Roma lack a homeland, a nation, and unity? And what unites this people, who are still dispersed across nations? Let's find out. After they arrived in Byzantium, the Roma settled in southern Europe, near Greece. By the 14th century, they were in Crete, Serbia, Croatia, and other Balkan countries, gradually moving west. No one then knew who the Roma were or where they were going. Moreover, there are still no written records about the Roma people's history before their arrival in Europe. We know almost nothing about why they appeared on the Byzantine border, but we do know where they came from. And for that, we owe thanks to linguists, not historians. In the 1760s, a student named Istvan Vida overheard 3 students from India chatting casually in their native language at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Istvan noticed that their dialect sounded somewhat like the Roma dialects he'd heard from workers on his family's estate. He approached the students and wrote down some words, later discovering that many of these words were easily understood by Dutch Roma. That sparked a revelation. If the Roma spoke an Indian language, they must have come from somewhere in India. The Indian origin theory of the Roma was later confirmed by modern linguistic and genetic research, but it all started back in the Middle Ages. In the early 14th century, an Irish monk visiting the eastern Mediterranean wrote about local Indians with many similarities to crows and coal, likely describing their darker skin color. A century later, German cartographer Sebastian Münster noted that the homeland of German Roma lay in Asia along the Ganges or Indus rivers. These people seemed to sense something, but the knowledge faded quickly. It's worth understanding that, for Europeans in the Middle Ages, the word India meant nothing specific, and India as a state name only emerged during British colonization. Folklore even suggested that the Roma came from the moon or Atlantis. Today, there's still no solid scientific consensus. Some researchers believe the Roma were originally warriors from northern India who fought against Muslim invaders led by Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 11th century. After their defense failed, they fled westward through the mountains into Persia, eventually reaching Europe in the Middle Ages. Another theory claims that the Roma were a lower caste in India, pointing to the unsanitary conditions often found in Roma camps. Some believe their ancestors were craftsmen or even entertainers in India, which might explain why many Roma in Europe became known for fortune-telling, dancing, singing, and snake charming. Ultimately, we may never truly know who the Roma were or what drove them to leave. One simple version of the Roma's migration to Europe is that they traveled from India to Persia, which was later conquered by Arabs. The Arabs then sent the Roma to what is now the Middle East, and eventually, the Byzantines shifted them toward Greece. Some European Roma later migrated back to Muslim countries, even reaching the Emirates. Of course, they don't drive sports cars down the streets of Dubai, they tend to avoid cities altogether. Asking the Roma about their origins doesn't reveal much either. They have no remaining ties to their ancient homeland, and they know as little about it as the scholars. When you're constantly moving from one place to another, preserving historical memory is challenging. The Roma never wrote down stories of their wanderings. Their journeys are fertile ground for colorful ancient myths, but not for a coherent national history. From a scientific perspective, historical memory forms in settled societies, people who live generation after generation on the same land and are interested in who lived there before them. They develop things like writing systems and states, which produce plenty of archived data. But the Roma had no archives. They didn't worry about preserving their memory, so their history is one-sided, told mostly by those who encountered them. Usually, that was law enforcement, the Inquisition, or other authorities, whom people often try to avoid. What Roma life was like outside of government scrutiny remains anyone's guess. The Roma have no homeland in any sense, which means they lack a crucial source of national identity. A homeland is a point of stability, a tool for uniting a nation. It's much more than just a piece of land. Its value is more spiritual and psychological. Nations with their own states can proudly say, "Here, things are different from everywhere else. Here, things work the way we like. Here, no one can tell us how to live." On a spiritual level, a homeland is a refuge, and this national feeling is an inexhaustible political resource. A homeland is, above all, an idea, a collective unconscious. History provides examples of peoples who maintained this sense of homeland even when their physical borders were lost. The most obvious example is the Jewish people, who, despite nearly 2,000 years of wandering, preserved the idea of the temple in Jerusalem, their central spiritual home. No one had seen it since the 1st century, but the stories were enough to keep it alive. But here's the key point: those stories existed, carefully passed down through generations. The Romani people never had a homeland like that, but they did have something else. Each Romani community generally lives independently, separated from neighboring groups. They call themselves Roma, though not everyone does this consistently. The term Roma is used mainly in political and academic contexts. Strictly speaking, there's no single Romani people. There are Romani Christians and Romani Muslims, separated by deep divides, and even within a single country, they differ significantly. For example, in Romanian Transylvania, there are Hungarian-speaking Roma, heavily influenced by the Hungarian language, and Vlach Roma, whose dialect closely resembles Romanian. The distance between these groups can be as little as 60 to 120 miles. In Russia, there are various distinct Romani ethnic groups, each with unique traditions, languages, and cultures, often living apart and rarely crossing paths. Additionally, not all Roma lead a nomadic lifestyle. Many are settled citizens of European countries, especially in Western Europe, and are far from the traditional Romani fortune-telling stereotypes. The idea of a single Romani culture is nearly impossible to pinpoint, even with a concentrated effort. Some Romani people may not even see other Roma as real Romani if their lifestyles or traditions differ. There's also a concept of Romanipan, which is something like a code of Romani values, a core of Romani spirit. If you lack this, you won't be accepted by a Romani society, no matter how Romani you are by blood. Loyalty to Romani traditions defines Romani identity, and one aspect of this is life on the move. Another foundation of Romani identity is the division of the world into us and them, the Roma and the Gaj, non-Roma. This division has contributed to the isolation of Roma communities from the wider world, as non-Roma and their cultures are inherently viewed as a threat. Interactions with the outside world are strictly controlled. Too much contact with Gaj can bring trouble. In the Romani language, the words for man, boy, woman, and girl differ depending on whether they refer to Gaj or Roma. Many Roma won't even sit at a table with a Gajo. Some even have different words for illnesses and curses based on whether they affect Roma or Gaj. So, it's not ethnicity but rather a way of life that defines Romani identity. You might think Romanipan could be the unifying element that could serve as the foundation for a Romani nation. But no, the divisions are too deep. The lack of a homeland and their fragmentation keep the Roma from beginning to unite. But these are minor issues compared to the problems the Roma faced in medieval Europe. Back to the Middle Ages, early 15th century, the Roma had arrived in German lands. A Bavarian city chronicle in Augsburg noted a Romani procession led by two dukes, with a group of 50 men accompanied by women and children. They had dark skin, were skilled in fortune-telling, and identified as exiles from Little Egypt. By the 15th century, Europeans had decided that the Roma were Egyptians, an idea that even reached Russia, where Roma were once called Pharaoh's people. The Roma didn't mind this theory. It was exotic, intriguing, and something out of a fairy tale. But the Roma had chosen a very unfortunate time to relocate to Europe. 600 years ago, Christian Europe was under threat from the Ottoman Turks, who were capturing one Christian kingdom after another. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, Europe's only city with a population of 1 million. At the same time, news of Mongol hordes and Spain's Muslim conquerors, the Moors, circulated widely. The Christian world felt encircled by enemies, and the Roma, with their southeastern appearance, were seen as part of this existential threat. Persecutions soon followed. Medieval legal systems showed remarkable efficiency. Anti-Romani laws often appeared just a few years after the Roma arrived in new lands. Amid the anti-Muslim panic, Roma were given new names and labels, sometimes called Saracens or Tatars, though the Egyptian story stuck best. The hysteria eventually subsided, as did the Ottoman Empire's expansion. Europeans quickly realized that the Roma weren't agents of the Turkish Sultan and weren't trying to convert anyone. The Roma managed, however marginally, to settle in their new homes. Their foreignness wasn't an issue if they provided unique services. They weren't allowed into city walls, but they were welcome on the outskirts. The Roma proved to be skilled artisans, quickly establishing beneficial bartering relationships. Eastern European Roma specialized in blacksmithing, jewelry, and horse trading, forming tightly knit artisan guilds and working in small groups. By the end of the Middle Ages, Roma were scattered across nearly all of Europe, but irritation began to build. Beggars irritated people first, and city anti-Romani laws were insufficient. They learned from experience and crafted a collective story. On their tours of Europe, the Roma would usually claim they were pilgrims on their way to some holy site, and it often worked. There were many holy places in medieval Christian Europe, and pilgrimage was the most popular reason to travel. If not for war or a market, then at least to Rome. The story worked when the Roma first entered a town. It even worked a second time, but soon enough, people realized that these dark-skinned strangers weren't visiting relics, they were just wandering from place to place. Attitudes toward them changed abruptly. Adding to this, after 1500, Europe's religious climate began to shift rapidly. What had once been a unified Catholic world split in two in just a few decades. Half a century after Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, nearly 40% of Europeans identified as Protestant. And for the Roma, the Reformation brought nothing good. What pilgrimage could they claim when all the holy sites belonged to the Pope, whom Protestants now despised? Their legend began to wear thin. Begging also became harder. While the Catholic Church accepted poverty as a virtue, pragmatic Protestants viewed it as a vice. The safety net of Christianity suddenly vanished, and xenophobia soared to historic heights. The Roma not only looked different but also practiced mysterious rituals. And, in general, settled communities were wary of nomads. Even today, the idea of tolerance for foreign cultures sparks hatred among some, and in the Middle Ages, there was no room for such ideas. Fear of outsiders acted as a social regulator. A person without prejudices and without social protection wouldn't last long. They had to be part of a community, whether a village, a social class, or, ideally, a noble family. In a world where your life and status depended on connections, drifters were doomed to robbery, murder, or exile. The Roma often didn't fit into the local church system either. Tradition dictated that each parish care for its own poor. While foreign beggars were denied church charity, they were expected to go back to their own pastors. But the Roma had neither pastors nor a homeland. With nowhere to turn, the Roma remained trapped in poverty. Their poverty reinforced itself, turning their communities into ghettos. Quickly, a stigma emerged, linking the Roma with crime. Romani camps gained a reputation as criminal enclaves. In some cases, this was true. The traditional crafts they brought from India gave way to criminal activities. Trading in crafts were replaced by theft, including horse thievery, fueling prejudice. Private discrimination eventually morphed into structural discrimination. An entire people became collectively persona non grata. For the next 2 centuries, until the mid-18th century, European states viewed the Roma as criminals by default. In the 16th century, England barred Roma entry. The law stated that vagrants aged 14 and older were to be whipped and branded on the right ear with a hot iron about an inch wide. Roma were literally branded like animals. Branding could be avoided if a local would take them on as a servant for a year. Not only were the Roma punished, but anyone associated with them was as well. Persecutions lasted a century and a half. In England, the Roma were still being hanged in the mid-17th century. In Germany, pogroms against the Roma continued until the Enlightenment. In Holland, Roma were hunted like animals. The French weren't much kinder. Louis XIV, the Sun King, lamented that his predecessors hadn't driven the Roma out of France and attempted to rectify this. Romani men were sentenced to life on the galleys, young boys were sent to almshouses, and Romani women had their heads shaved. Those who continued to wander were flogged and exiled without trial. But it was worse in the Balkans. In Romania, to be Romani was to be a slave. It's hard to pinpoint when this started, but by the end of the 14th century, it was accepted as the social norm. Monasteries were the primary beneficiaries of this free labor, though the nobility also used enslaved Roma as a labor force. Romani slavery even became an export business, with slaves sent across the ocean to European colonies in the Americas, where labor was in high demand. Today, many Romani in the New World are descendants of those slaves, much like African Americans, but they arrived even earlier. The first Romani slaves were taken to the West Indies by Christopher Columbus, a century before African slaves arrived. One theory is that Romani enslavement was tied to the Crusades. The frequent conscription of men to fight in the Middle East left Southern Europe with a labor shortage, and vulnerable, defenseless Roma were nearby. Over time, this practice evolved into full-scale slavery. If you were a Romani in medieval Europe, your life would be fraught with suffering and danger, with no clear place to turn. In Eastern Europe, you might be sold into slavery to a noble. If you tried to go to Northern or Western Europe, you could be accused of espionage for the Turks or heresy, leading to execution. Yet, despite the harsh anti-Romani laws, Roma still found ways to survive. Some townspeople ignored the bans, choosing trade over conflict. Corrupt officials, bribed, often looked the other way. And medieval policing was inconsistent. Europe's fragmented law enforcement couldn't enforce strict control. Over time, repression of the Roma became normalized, and there was no chance for any self-organization among them. Even in the 17th century, when humanist and Enlightenment ideas began spreading across Europe, attitudes toward the Roma remained negative. They were still seen as criminals and kept at a distance from settled society. The Roma, as wanderers and nomads, continued to be viewed as a threat to the peace of settled communities. In the 19th century, with the rise of scientific racism, hatred of the Roma and other minorities was supposedly validated by pseudo-scientific theories. European scientists began measuring skulls and claimed that the Romani skull shape was evidence of their innate criminality. These theories influenced the views later used by the Nazis to justify their anti-Romani policies. In the 1930s and 1940s, under Nazi rule, discrimination against the Roma reached horrific proportions. The Roma fell under the Nuremberg race laws, which banned marriages and sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans. Although the Nazis' own mythology suggested that the Aryans originated from India, meaning that the Roma might theoretically be related, the Nazis ignored this paradox. For them, the Roma were social outcasts and undesirable elements. Led by Robert Ritter, the Nazis conducted racial studies on the Romani community and ultimately decided to pursue the final solution to the Gypsy question. Thousands of Roma were forcibly sterilized, deported, and sent to death camps. The genocide of the Roma, known as the Porajmos, literally devouring or rape, took the lives of a quarter to half of all Roma in Europe. The exact number of victims remains unknown and is estimated to be between 250,000 and 1.5 million people. Tragically, the Nazis applied harsher standards to the Roma than to other ethnic groups, even if a person's Romani heritage could be traced to just 1 or 2 great-grandparents out of 8, they could still be sentenced. After the war, the scale of the Porajmos remained largely in the shadows. The Nuremberg trials barely addressed the Romani genocide, and the Roma received no compensation or official acknowledgement of their suffering. In most European countries, anti-Romani laws stayed in effect even after the war. In Germany, even into the late 1940s, surviving Roma were still persecuted and, in some cases, were even sent back to camps, this time as forced labor. In the Soviet Union, the Roma's tragedy also went largely unrecognized. Their nomadic lifestyle was essentially outlawed by anti-vagrancy laws, forcing many to settle, which was a huge challenge for the community. In Europe, anti-Romani laws persisted into the 1950s. For example, Interpol actively used files on the Roma collected by the Nazis. Authorities in Germany and other countries argued that wartime measures against the Roma had been legitimate state policy. Only in 1982 did German Chancellor Helmut Kohl officially recognize that the Roma were victims of Nazi genocide. Tragically, the genocide, which decimated the Romani population in Europe, did little to change their place in society. Historical memory of the Porajmos remained largely within Romani families, passed down orally and rarely discussed publicly. Most books about this tragedy were written by Jewish scholars, as the Roma themselves rarely sought to document and study the events of the Porajmos. After the war, the Roma lacked the resources and leaders needed for political organization. The genocide had wiped out young activists and intellectuals who might have revived the Romani movement. Efforts to create a national organization also failed. There was no one to represent Romani interests on the international stage, and their tragedy was barely mentioned at Nuremberg. Despite these obstacles, steps were taken in the 1950s and 1960s to restore Romani cultural heritage and political status. In Paris, a man named Ionel Rotaru, who presented himself as the supreme leader of French Roma, drew attention to their issues. Rotaru dreamed of creating a Romanistan, an imagined homeland for all Roma, a national refuge. Rotaru established a center in Paris called Connate Mondial, the World Romani Community, which served as the headquarters of his imagined Romani government. From his office, he corresponded with governments, organized international meetings, and gathered Romani communities. While symbolic, his project succeeded in drawing attention to the issues facing the Roma in France. The French government even funded educational programs for Romani children. Rotaru hoped that education would be the first step toward Romani unity and lead to the recognition of their national identity on an international level. However, his project faced resistance. The French authorities saw him as a threat. In 1965, under Charles de Gaulle, all of Rotaru's organizations were banned on the grounds that they were led by a foreigner. Rotaru was forced to move to Switzerland, where he continued his work, though his organization's influence declined. Despite these challenges, Rotaru's ideas laid the foundation for larger international Romani movements. In 1971, the first World Romani Congress was held, where the Romani flag, anthem, and International Romani Day were established. The flag, with a red wheel on a blue and green background, symbolized the Romani connection to the earth and sky, and the anthem, Gelum, Gelum, became a symbol of Romani unity. Today, the International Romani Union holds observer status at the United Nations, and the struggle for Romani rights continues, although they remain one of Europe's most marginalized groups.